Hi guys, I'm going to talk to you today about ritual and specifically about the different forms of ritual and practice that have developed in my own spiritual practice over the years and the differentiations that I've made in my own mind between the different types of practices that I might decide to undertake at any one time and kind of my evolving thoughts on that. So this relates pretty closely to a topic that I've come back to over and over again over the years, really over the past 5 or 6 years. It's been something that I've kind of come back to again and again, and that is the question of the relationship or the difference between practices of well-being and self-development and practices that are more specifically to do with devotion or looking outward to the world rather than inward on the self. And that is something that, I'll give a brief overview in this video on what my ideas around that kind of have been and how they've kind of shifted over time. But I actually created a playlist that brings together, I think, pretty much it's a pretty comprehensive list of all the different videos I've made around this topic. Some of them are kind of more closely related to it than others, and I'll link that in the kind of little clicky information little bubble up there where it has suggested videos for you so that you can go and have a look at any of those videos. And maybe some of them will be more of interest to you than others, but you can have a look at that playlist and see if you want to watch any of those out of curiosity, maybe to see how my ideas have changed over time. At the end of this video, I'm going to be making an announcement about spiritual mentoring, so if you are interested in that, do stick around to the end of the video, or if you're not interested in the rest of the content of this video, you can skip ahead to the end of the video if that's what you're interested in. So I just kind of realised that it had been a while since I delved into this topic on the channel, and it is something, as I said, that I have repeatedly struggled with over the years. The 6 videos that are in that playlist, they don't even really cover all of the times that I've grappled with this question over the years on the channel, because it really is something that has been at the heart of every single time that I've stumbled in my practice, or realised that I've been a bit stagnant, or really just thought at all about the structure of my practice and what ritual means to me, what my practice is and what it's supposed to achieve, and so on. I've always kind of come back to this core question of, to what extent is it self-development? To what extent is it self-focused? Is it based on well-being? Is it based on mundane well-being? And to what extent is it kind of outwardly focused on the world, on my connection to the world, on a concept of divinity that is beyond myself, outside of myself, transpersonal, and so on? And I've very much kind of swung between focusing on one and focusing on the other, and across the videos that I've linked in that playlist, especially in the ones that are maybe more focused on that direct question of, one versus the other, I kind of swung across the years, and you'll see that if you have a look at those videos, from originally kind of combining the two and feeling that the two were just totally intertwined, not really having a problem with that, feeling that doing inner work and thinking about my own personal identity and how the inner workings of myself were functioning, that was just inextricably linked to my devotion and to my feeling of relatedness to the universe and to the way that I could relate to concepts of divinity. Later on, basically what happened was I started to question that. I started to doubt whether that was the best way forward for me. I started to doubt if that was effective. I started to feel that I had had kind of an over focus on the self, and too much of a focus as well on kind of perfecting the self or trying to find some kind of ideal inner self that was kind of the most true and the most true to myself and so on, that there was some ideal that I could reach and that would be bringing me closer to being the kind of spiritual person that I wanted to be, and that kind of ended up being something that I stripped away. I went through a phase, I think around the time just before I went to Edinburgh, where I tried really segregating the two concepts in my practice, and I continued to do spiritual practices that were focused on well-being, that were focused on the self. I was interested at the time in chakra work, I was working with crystals, I was doing kind of meditation that was focused on that kind of attaining a sense of centeredness and just a sense of enlightenment, I suppose, in the self. But I was also trying to make my I guess primarily my celebrations of the Wheel of the Year, I wanted them to be more focused on devotion, on outward celebration and so on. And then in the years that followed, I guess I just developed an appreciation again for why the two things are linked. And I think especially in this community where we are kind of eking out our own spiritual path, it makes sense that working on ourselves is going to be central to that project, because we sort of we can't really find our own personal spiritual truths if we are divorced from ourselves and divorced from what is happening internally, and if we're not kind of confronting our emotional selves, our emotional being, and our unconscious selves and so on. It does make sense that those two things would end up being intertwined, and that there is this feeling across the community that delving into the self, getting to know the self, and grappling with the kind of inner experiences, that is going to lead us to spiritual experience, that it is going to lead us to just a better kind of understanding of reality. So I think where I've landed at the moment anyway, but I think gradually over time this has been where I've settled to, is to a point where I am quite satisfied having the two kind of aims of my practice in terms of well-being and devotion to be relatively separated. And now this is not something that's necessarily going to work for everyone. I know that a lot of people will feel that, you know, doing inner work, doing magical workings that are focused on the self, or that are focused on kind of mundane reality, that is very much a part of devotion, that is an expression of devotion, of especially if you have pantheistic beliefs. It makes sense to me that would be part of that devotional work. And I'm absolutely not denigrating that, but for me personally, I feel like more and more over time where I'm kind of moving towards is a place where I am seeing more and more segregation between the functions of my different rituals, the functions of my different kind of practices. And that for me is actually helping me to isolate the different types of functions and practices that are actually going on in what I feel like my spiritual practice. It is more of this kind of umbrella term for a very broad and general area of my life, an area of my experience as a human. It really touches on a huge amount of my life, and I would really subsume a lot of other things under that. I would even subsume a lot of my kind of interpersonal relationships under that umbrella, and I would certainly subsume any kind of creative work, creative expression, especially kind of abstract and artistic creative expression, that kind of thing. But really any kind of creative endeavour I would sort of subsume under that category. There's a lot of different things that go on in this kind of realm of what I see as a kind of alternative way of looking at the world. It's my space in which to let go of the skepticism that I kind of generally hold in the world, to let go of critical thinking, to let go of academic thinking, and to sort of embody a more symbolic kind of experience of the world, to embody a more, to me, it's a more optimistic way of living. Again, that's not going to be the case for everyone, but that is my own personal experience and my own personal kind of bias, I suppose, is that is a state of mind I need to be in to feel the most kind of expansive and optimistic and so on. So it is a very important part of myself to work on. And there are times when I can let a lot of that slide, when I can kind of fall into the trap of just feeling very stuck in kind of a very mundane sense of reality, a very critical way of looking at the world. At those times I tend to just be very focused on social relationships in their kind of nuts and bolts, and kind of on social structures and cultural structures, politics and so on. And if I lose sight of that kind of more magical thinking, I suppose things can start to feel very bland and very dull and a bit depressing. But I guess my wider point is that I have gradually realised that just because all of these different practices and all of these different parts of what I generally think of as my spirituality don't necessarily look the same or have the same ends, it doesn't mean that they are conflicting with one another, or that I'm confused, or that I need to have a better focus or anything. But B, it also doesn't mean that they actually have to interact with one another all the time. Not every single ritual that I do, not every single time that I spend at the altar necessarily needs to be pointing in the same direction. So back in 2015, what I did was I actually had two separate altars, and I really tried to split apart the two. Currently, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not really interested in that, because what I am interested in is bringing the kind of symbolic structure of my spiritual beliefs as a whole. So those kind of the symbols that I find evocative. My altar to me is a symbolic representation of cosmos in a sort of artistic and metaphorical and symbolically rich kind of way of expressing it. It's something that speaks very much to my unconscious. It speaks to my my child self. It speaks to my artistic self, and that it doesn't really have to be specific to you know, the parts of me that are in that mindset, but that actually engage with the outer world, that engage with friends, that engage with relationships. It doesn't have to be separate from that, but also it can be a separate experience to sit at that altar and to focus on my devotional experience to concepts of divinity. So I'm very happy at the moment to be using the same altar for all of those different functions, because I'm sort of seeing it as this is my mindset, this is my kind of spiritual mindset, and it can be used and applied to different aspects of my life, and I can come to this altar to approach and kind of solve different aspects of my life, and that's okay, and that doesn't take away from the more sort of mystical experiences that I might also have in that altar space, that don't necessarily connect to my day-to-day experiences, to my mundane experiences, to my career, to my friendships, and so on. So going forward, my intention is actually to start doing more ritual and to spend more structured time at the altar. I think up until now, what has happened is that at the Sabbaths, I tend to do kind of devotional work. I tend to focus on the outer world. I tend to focus on abstract concepts of divinity, on the cycles of the earth, on the cycles of cosmos, and I use that time to sort of connect to that. And then there will be a little bit of sort of psycho-spiritual work going on as well, where I sort of try to connect to how I'm feeling at that moment in time, how that connects to that outer kind of cosmic pattern, but the focus has been on that kind of devotional, mystical element of spirituality. And then my daily practice, such as it is, tends to be maybe a little bit more well-being focused. At the moment, that's really just meditation, but I will sometimes come to the altar and journal, or I do a sort of oral journaling, like I talk into a mic, like I make kind of audio notes for myself sometimes instead of writing down. I actually find that to be a really productive way of journaling. I personally just, it feels more like chatting to a friend, except I'm chatting to myself or chatting to deity. I've over the years found that to be really useful. And yeah, just an interesting alternative to kind of classic kind of handwritten journaling. So I will sometimes do that at the altar, but that I really haven't, and for a very long time anyway, for many, many years, I really haven't been using my altar space or sacred space in order to, I suppose, to work what many of us would consider magic. I have made videos in the past about magic. I'll link something up above, and about kind of pantheistic understandings of magic, my understandings of what magic might be, of how it might work. I generally have a sort of psychological, symbolic understanding of magic and how that might work. But it is something in the past that I have considered that I would want to have as part of my practice and for various different functions. But it's not something that I was actually doing at all, really, for many, many years. But very recently, I did actually do a ritual. I won't share here, you know, what that was aiming at, but it was a very important ritual that I needed to construct for myself, and it was entirely based around mundane circumstances in my life. Kind of quite a lot of seismic stuff that was happening internally that I realised just needed to be sort of resolved, and that the best way for me to do that was in ritual space, in sacred space at the altar, and through a kind of magical working. And I have found that to be incredibly useful, incredibly productive. It really seems to have signaled something for me emotionally. It really seems to be helping me to kind of put to rest the things that needed to be put to rest, and to move on into the next kind of phase that I needed to move on into, and to just kind of make that movement, that kind of emotional, psychological movement that needed to be made. And I mean, I shouldn't be surprised by this. Very few of you watching this will be surprised by that. I mean, this is what we do, isn't it? It is a large part of what we do, and we do it because we know that it works. But for a long time, I think I wasn't really mindful of that. I was a bit dismissive of it for myself, I think, for some reason, that things like that could have an effect for me. But I am really now thinking that I want to do more of that in my life, that I want to actually dedicate more time to doing those kinds of rituals. But I also want to be doing kind of more devotional rituals. So I guess, again, as I did in the past, I'm actually going to be splitting my time into kind of two general separate categories. So in my mind, I'm kind of, as I say, these are two kind of broadly two categories, and they do kind of fit into the categories of well-being and devotion, as I said. I was also thinking about it as a separation between witchcraft and mysticism, in that witchcraft often tends to be used for, you know, as I tend to call it, the more mundane matters in life. Witchcraft tends to be quite practical. Popular witchcraft and kind of general witchcraft tends to be like fairly practical and focused on improving our own lives for ourselves, improving other people's lives around us, and healing and so on. And yeah, that's kind of how I'm seeing that sort of well-being side of things. And then the other side is the mystical, which I think witchcraft can play a role in, absolutely. But my mind kind of separates the two into those categories, and there certainly can be very, I don't think that a mystical experience means that you have to just be sort of, that it has to be very ascetic and that you have to be just sort of sitting at the altar in deep meditation or anything. Like, I definitely think there are other routes to mystical ecstatic experiences that can include kind of heavy use of ritual, heavy kind of symbolic use and use of tools and so on. I think there are, you know, many different routes towards that kind of experience. But those are kind of the two broad categories that I'm kind of looking at. And then I would kind of separate those two categories into two further categories, actually. I would look at the witchcraft kind of well-being side and see that, you know, you might have the kind of big rituals, you might have those big kind of big changes like the one that I underwent recently, where you might have, I suppose you might look at this as kind of a time frame for magical workings as well, that you might have something that needs to be undertaken in ritual, or something that you want to symbolically kind of work through that is, yeah, like big picture, that it's a big change, maybe to do with the ending of a relationship, with some big change that's coming about in yourself, with moving country, with, you know, so many big kind of and I say big, it doesn't even need to necessarily be because something physically kind of dramatic is happening, but just that it's big emotionally for you, that there's some seismic shift happening internally. And then I feel like that there are the more kind of the small scale kind of workings, which can also be very important, but that they might be more, maybe more mundane, maybe more specific, like focused on one specific issue that you're kind of working on. Those tend to be the things that I really don't turn to witchcraft for. I really don't turn to the altar or spirituality for. You know, I'm not the kind of person who does workings in order to kind of, you know, drum up business, in order to solve a monetary issue, like a kind of a wealth issue, a health issue, even a relationship issue. It's really not something that I tend to use my spiritual practice for, and I may not ever do that, but it is something that I'm now starting to consider, because I'm starting to kind of see just the value in that side of spiritual practice, and in using those kind of symbolic acts as a way of really shaking things up and really moving things along emotionally, psychologically, and I suppose energetically in your life if you work with an energetic model of magic. And then on the other side, on the more kind of devotional side, I'm kind of seeing there are various different ways, obviously, to go about that, but in my own practice, I would kind of be separating that in my own mind between sort of vague sort of abstract attempts to connect with divinity, with cosmos, with this sort of just overarching pattern that we're all a part of, and so on. And that is generally what I'm focusing on at the Sabbats. But then also there is then the focus on individual deity, which for me tends to be a different kind of experience, because of my understanding of what deity is. Deity for me is kind of a combination of like an archetype, so something that is kind of dwelling within the self, like a part of the unconscious self, an idea that we have that resides within the self, that we connect parts of ourselves to, but also that is reflected in kind of cosmic patterns and earthly patterns and so on, and that we see this kind of connection between things that are happening within our emotional sphere and things that are happening kind of outside of ourselves. So it tends to feel like a much more kind of interpersonal relationship. It tends to feel more kind of close to home and a bit more personal, whereas, you know, the kind of more general, vague kind of devotion towards a pantheistic divinity is quite broad, and it's quite intangible, and it's quite, you know, often without words. I mean, I do write prayers and devotions often to that sort of vague sense of divinity, but it's easier to address a specific deity. So for me, those practices tend to be quite different. And when I'm doing devotionals towards specific deities, I'm usually doing that on a more kind of long-term daily basis, as opposed to doing kind of one grand ritual. Although I often do incorporate work with deities into my Sabbath rituals as well. I actually have various specific kind of rituals that I do at different times of the year that relate sometimes to a specific deity and so on. But yeah, those are my thoughts for now on what the kind of four main parts of my spiritual practice might be. I suppose maybe I should have the fifth area of meditation all for itself, because meditation just for me is the cornerstone of my practice. It is what centers me and grounds me. I mostly do it at the altar. And it is just kind of the cornerstone for me. If I'm not meditating every day, I tend to start slipping out of that kind of spiritual mindset, and it is what kind of brings me back to that mentality, and it is what kind of gives me clarity and just allows me to be occupying that kind of part of myself and that part of my view of the world on a daily basis. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on this and your thoughts on the relationship between these two sides. It's something that maybe I will come back to again as a very final note on that topic before I go into my kind of the kind of more PSA kind of part of this video. I just will say that the reason it's becoming relevant for me right now is that I actually because I did a ritual around, like close to my birthday and close to Halloween this year, and on what most people consider to be Samhain on the 31st of October, and that ended up being my kind of more witchcraft oriented kind of practice. I will actually be, I'm recording this video on the 7th of November, which is, this is the day this year that the cross quarter falls on, so that's the midpoint between, I had to take a minute there and think where we were on the wheel of the year, the midpoint between the equinox and the winter solstice. And that is generally where I do my ritual. For me, it makes sense, and because for me this is going to be the beginning of winter, it often doesn't feel like the beginning of winter until about a week into November here in Ireland. So I'm going to be doing that kind of more devotional, more kind of outward focused ritual tonight. And I'm liking this setup so much that I'm starting to think I might try doing this every Sabbath, or at least maybe 4 of them a year, that I might do it at the cross quarters. And because I end up with those 2 dates, I end up with the sort of traditional date that most people are celebrating at the beginning of the month, and then I have maybe a week, 5 days to 7 days later, I'll have the day that I actually do my ritual. So I like the idea of doing 2. I mean, it's a lot of extra time to commit to, but I like that. I'm at a place right now where I want to be committing to more time at the altar and more spiritual practice. So that's something that I'm going to consider trying moving forward. So yeah, that's it for that. So finally, I just want to talk to you very briefly about spiritual mentoring. I mentioned in the last video that I was probably going to be announcing this soon in my newsletter. And then I didn't actually get to kind of make a confirmation video about this right before the newsletter went out. I did indeed send out a newsletter recently, and I did announce that I was starting spiritual mentoring in that newsletter. The way that I'm working it right now is that I sort of announced it just for newsletter subscribers. So I gave kind of the information and the details in that newsletter, and an email address for you to email if you're interested and to kind of get the ball rolling. So I would say that if you kind of missed that last week, if you didn't hear me say that that was going to be a thing coming up and you're not a newsletter subscriber and you would like to be, then you can click the link below. I'll put a link to subscribe to the newsletter, and if you do sign up to that newsletter anytime this month, then I will send out the newsletter that I sent. Like I'll resend it out to you. I think I should be able to. I haven't tried doing that before, but I'm fairly sure that I should be able to do that, to send you an individual email with that announcement, and you can get all the information that you need in that. But as I say, this is something I'm going to be rolling out kind of more officially in the coming months. I'm going to probably wait until January because I'm anticipating taking quite a break in December. I'm going to be having my Viva at the end of this month for my PhD, which means that I will know at that point how much more work I have to do until it's completely done. I'm really hoping that I might be able to get it all finished before Christmas and then take some sort of substantial break off everything, because I haven't really given myself a lot of opportunity to take a complete break off everything, and I think I'm going to need just to kind of sit back for a little while. So I'm going to wait until January to kind of properly kind of get a new website going, get a page up on the website where you can go to that page and read everything you need to know and just sort everything out through the website rather than having to kind of send me an email or whatever. So that will all be coming, and I'll announce that again at the time. But yeah, in case you just kind of want to find out more right now or get going with it right now, and then like I say, check out down below, there's a link for the newsletter. So yeah, thanks a million for watching, for being here, for commenting and liking and subscribing and doing all those wonderful things. I'm absolutely loving being back on YouTube again and chatting to you in the comments and so on. So yeah, do leave a comment if you have any questions or any just comments in general on the topic of this video, and yeah, I'll be talking to you again soon.